Death stalks this family. In a few moments, their world will be thrown into chaos, and they will lose each other. The place is Central America. It is 536 AD. A supervolcano awakes. One of the greatest volcanic eruptions ever seen by humankind will devastate the region, killing over 40,000 people and laying waste to the land. 6 years later, and half a world away, a deadly scourge preys upon a defenseless people. Millions will suffer a gruesome fate. Two 6th century empires, each facing a crisis that will change their world. On Perfect Storms. The year is 536 AD. A cloud of ash and dust smothers the planet, causing global climate change and famine. The cause of this ash cloud has, until recently, baffled both scientists and historians. Professor Rob Dull studies ancient natural disasters and their consequences. He thinks his research provides the answer. Lake Ilopango in El Salvador. At 28 square miles in size, it's one of the biggest volcanoes in Central America. Dull believes it erupted around 1,500 years ago.
So if you do all the math and you calculate the size of the hole, it's over 100 cubic kilometers. It gives you the sense of the massive amount of material that was blown out in a very short period of time.
It's enough to cover the whole of El Salvador in many feet of ash and send billions of tons into the upper atmosphere, which encircles the globe.
If we're correct, the Ilopango eruption, in terms of its affects both locally in El Salvador, regionally throughout the Maya realm, and beyond in places like Europe, the Mediterranean basin, the Roman Empire, the cumulative effects in terms of death toll will represent the greatest volcanic catastrophe in human history.
Rob has dated the eruption to within 120 years of 536 AD, but to prove his theory, he needs to date it precisely. And to do that, he needs hard evidence. Across El Salvador, the Ilopango eruption left a deep deposit of white ash, which still blankets the country.
This deposit, well, you can see we got about a meter here, maybe three feet or so right here. Well, you can keep measuring 1, 2, 3, at least 4 meters here at this location. This is almost like beach sand, and then it gets really fine. This stuff up here is like clay, and that continues all the way up.
Somewhere hidden within these layers, Rob hopes to find the evidence that will not only prove his theory, but rewrite the history books as well. 1,500 years ago, El Salvador was the realm of the Maya, an ancient civilization that stretched across Central America. Azan is a Mayan farmer. For countless generations, the ancestors of Azan have cultivated this soil. And beneath the ash of Ilopango, Rob Dull is now uncovering this lost world. finds the ghostly imprint of cornfields that have been preserved in the dust for 1,500 years.
Here's the top of the ridge where they would have planted the corn plant. Here's the bottom. This is known as a furrow. There's another ridge, there's another furrow, and so on.
It's not just their fields that have been discovered buried beneath the ash, but also the specter of lost lives.
This was a Maya village. Here we have an example of how the commoners lived at that time. This is a family home. The average number of a family at the time would be around 4.
Nice piece of pottery. Yep. Here's a piece. Here's another piece of ceramic.
In their villages, they would use vessels like this for serving food. This is part of a plate with large supports.
But Azan's hold on his land is precarious. His family's existence is subject to the whim of forces beyond any man's control. Ilopango is a caldera, one of the most extreme and powerful kinds of volcanoes known to modern science. Just 3 miles beneath the lake sits the magma chamber, a reservoir of molten rock where pressure builds until an eruption is triggered.
It is an active volcano. Eventually, one moment, something happens and there's too much pressure and it breaks.
1,500 years ago, beneath the still waters of Lake Ilopango, the point of no return is about to be reached. The signs of a coming catastrophe are everywhere.
There were a lot of seismic events, earthquakes, small earthquakes, big earthquakes. A lot of color changes in the lake, a lot of dead fish. The magma was close to surface. And there was a lot of smoke and the smell of sulfur was here. The level of the lake rises.
As the slumbering giant stirs from the top of his temple pyramid, a Mayan king believes that he can prevent disaster.
Here is an example of their blade technology. This is a piece of obsidian. It's very sharp. It's you could easily cut yourself with that blade.
To appease the gods and stop the volcanic monster from erupting, the Mayans sacrifice one of their own. The victim's heart is ripped from his body and burned as an offering.
If you can imagine that, the whole town watching the king giving blood not only to the people, to the earth, that would be very powerful.
But no matter how much blood is shed, no man can stop the volcano.
very difficult to understand what's going on and what kind of activity it's going to be until you don't have that much time to react. They're not blind. They'll see that, and they'll feel it, and they'll start getting concerned, and they'll start asking questions. Some of them will leave, others won't. And if you have a good enough sense of survival, then you get out.
With the pressure increasing inside the magma chamber, the volcano erupts. And Azan is witness to a moment that will change his world and the history of the Maya for good.
As the ash fell, and as the sky filled with volcanic ash, the sky would have gone dark. There would have been rain. There would have been lightning. And at some point, they would have realized that this is not a safe place to be. I need to get out of this hell.
It's 536 AD, and Ilopango, a volcano in Central America, has erupted, spewing massive amounts of pumice and ash into the air, and the Mayan people are at nature's mercy. 1,500 years later, signs of that eruption are still visible. Beneath the city of San Salvador, Professor Rob Dull uncovers evidence of the first terrifying moments of the Ilopango eruption.
We've got the ridge, and here's the furrow. It's full of pumice. You can see here, which also tells us about that initial blast that would have killed everything right in the beginning. Anything living would have been dead before it started piling up.
Within seconds of the eruption, pyroclastic flows of superheated gas and pumice spilled on the flanks of Ilopango.
It's just like an avalanche. The difference between the pyroclastic flow and an avalanche is that it is really hot.
On the ridges, those were almost blasted off like you would see in a hurricane, where the winds just blasted off the top.
They can go hundreds of kilometers per hour. Faster than a car. You can't beat it.
It would have been a fiery blast. It would have been like the worst wildfire you can imagine.
If you wait for the volcano to start having that type of activity, it's too late.
Everyone was dead. All the plants were gone. Everything was burned off.
The pyroclastic flow engulfs an area over 750 square miles around the volcano.
No one would have survived. What that tells us is that probably 40 to 80,000 people were instantly killed.
Since he's outside this immediate zone of death, Azan survives the eruption. But the fiery beast has only just awoken. Ash and sulfuric acid aerosols now begin to spew out of the caldera. A noxious cloud rises more than 25 miles into the upper atmosphere, where it's carried by the winds and blankets the earth. Scientists now know that volcanic activity can cause short-term climate change. In 1991, the ash cloud produced by the Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines reflected up to 10% of the sun's rays, causing global temperatures to drop by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Rob Dull believes the same thing happened when Ilopango blew around 536 AD. The only difference is that Ilopango is 10 times bigger than Pinatubo.
The eruption that happened here potentially had a global effect on climate. And the greatest short-term climate anomaly that we know from the last 2,000 years, short-term cooling, was the AD 536 event.
Scientists know this cooling event because of evidence appearing in growth rings of ancient trees found in North America, Europe, and Ireland.
The tree was simply growing and responding to its growth conditions. And after that, we see a series of growth anomalies. And it does go extraordinarily narrow at the point of colour change with dramatically narrow rings. So this tree was put under stress. It's undoubtedly clear that this was a very unusual event and the trees were very badly affected. To see it simultaneously in a whole series of trees tells you that it was a large-scale event.
The 536 AD Ilopango eruption is one that science is only now understanding, thanks to Rob Dull. The volcano spewed out enough matter to create a veil of ash around the world.
Our best estimate for the total volume of dense rock equivalent of magma, the stuff that came out of the caldera, is about 84 cubic kilometers. Okay, so it's a tremendous volume and unprecedented in this part of the world when humans have been here.
It probably was an eruption that lasted a few days to a couple of weeks.
It would have been very loud, booming sounds. We know that these sounds are heard up to 1,000 kilometers away or more. The fine ash would have started to pile up, white, which they never would have seen before. Obviously, the first thing you might do if something like that is going on is get to the safety of your house.
All of the buildings are made of earth sticks that are covered with mud. The roofs in all of the structures, they were made a wooden frame that was covered with thatch. Very fragile, very fragile.
What they might not have known is if they went to the safety of their dwellings, the ash would have piled up on top of the roof.
Ash is also rock, so if it falls on your roof and it accumulates, just like snow, it will collapse your roof. So you really can't hide in a house.
Miles from the caldera. Professor Dull is looking to prove his theory that the eruption of Ilopango occurred around 536 AD and triggered global climate change. He needs hard evidence from ground zero, something that will date the eruption precisely.
The ideal sample for dating the Ilopango eruption would be a tree that was growing at the time that the eruption occurred and that was rooted into the soil of the year that the eruption happened. This tree was growing at the time of the eruption. It was probably part of a larger forest with many trees this size. Look at this. There's pumice embedded in the little splinters between the tree. I can hear this tree cracking off. There's no doubt that this tree was living at the time of the eruption. There's no doubt that the eruption killed the tree. And there's no doubt that if we can get to the center of the tree, that we can actually once and for all date this event precisely, hopefully within a couple of decades, which should tell us if this event was the cause of the great dust veil that encircled the northern hemisphere in AD 536.
This is the land of the Maya. It's where the ancestors of Azan have lived for over 2,000 years. Now, it's the realm of the dead, where as many as 80,000 people were killed. Many thousands more are homeless.
We're looking at as many as 400,000 people displaced, refugees, who would have tried to leave. Of those, there is little chance that a majority of them would have made it out alive.
1 week after the eruption of Ilopango, ash continues to fall, and darkness descends on the Maya.
We know from modern studies that ash and depositions of 10 to 20 centimeters can be devastating to agriculture. As those people left, many of them didn't have food stores, they didn't have clean water sources, and so it was really a living hell. And all they could do was run or walk away. And in order to get to a place that was relatively safe from the effects, would have taken them many days walking. Unless they had the foresight to collect up corn and other materials to eat, they wouldn't have had materials to get very far. My feeling is that at least half of those, and probably much more, would have died trying to get out of the area.
The question is, where would they escape to? Centuries later, Rob Dull is on the verge of an important discovery. This tree has been entombed in ash for the last 1,500 years.
This represents a snapshot in time. When that pyroclastic flow came over the hill, it snapped this tree in a second and probably killed most living organisms right in this area. This is a fantastic find. It's the most impressive specimen found that I've ever seen.
Rob hopes that samples from this tree will be hard evidence that proves his theory, that Ilopango was the volcano that erupted around 536 AD and changed the Mayan world. Following the eruption, thousands flee their homeland.
The people would have evacuated, but what they didn't know is that there was no place to go. There was no place that was safe after this eruption. To get to a place that did not have all of those effects, they would have had to walk for days and days. They might have thought, I want to go to where I have other relatives or maybe another village. But what they didn't realize is that all of those places were as bad or worse off than they were.
Ash is dust, and it's very, if you breathe that, Think of it as forming into cement in your lungs. You can actually die from breathing dust. So it's very chaotic. It's a nightmare. If you manage to live through something like this, it would be just like living through hell.
Survivors of a widespread disaster often experience a range of intense emotions and reactions, many of them considered universal.
The most common sensory distortion that people go through in most disasters is the sensation that time is slowing down. Why would that be so common? It's not well understood, but clearly it is your brain trying to help you. Sort of pixelating what's happening, slowing it down. And that's your brain doing that on purpose to help you survive.
No doubt, those who survived the Ilopango eruption suffered great personal losses, as well as the shared loss of their homeland, which was left devastated for years. Now, this tree sample may solve one of history's greatest riddles. What caused the dramatic climate change of 536 AD?
There is no doubt in the scientific community that the AD 536 cold event happened. It's been called the mystery AD 536 event for decades.
Rob Dull believes the culprit was Ilopango. But up until now, scientists have only been able to date the eruption to a window of 120 years, sometime between 420 and 540 AD. That's too big a range to be conclusive. Now, with this new sample, Rob believes he could be on the verge of a major discovery.
This is the tree that we dug up in El Salvador below the ash from the Ilopango eruption.
In the laboratory, the sample goes through radiocarbon dating and tree ring analysis in order to pinpoint the eruption more precisely. The results are now in.
This is extremely exciting. We have it down to 4 decades now. We basically now know that this eruption occurred sometime between roughly 500 AD and 540 AD. This has to be the eruption that caused 536 AD. There's no other explanation that we know of.
"1,500 years ago, ash is dumped across Central America. Deposits have been found at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, up to 30 miles from shore. For 2 weeks, Azan has walked through a desert of ash, and now there is nowhere else to go. All he has left is a memory of loss. The eruption of Ilopango coincides with what's called the Mayan hiatus, a gap in the archaeological record when cities in the region are abandoned and pyramids left to ruin. In El Salvador, it will be at least another 100 years before new settlers return.
If we were to enter into a house before, we would see an array of items, the artifacts of the house, including the pottery, that would be completely different, with almost no single point of continuity with what we would see in the house of settlers who came in after the Ilopango event. this disappears.
When Ilopango erupted in 536 AD, it was a catastrophe, killing tens of thousands and destroying much of the ancient Mayan realm. But it may not be the last time it stirs. Scientists acknowledge another eruption could one day happen again.
This volcano could become active almost any time. It could be a very hazardous volcano if it comes alive again. It doesn't mean that in our lifetime it will occur. There's enough evidence that this volcano doesn't erupt that frequently. But still we need to be aware of what it's doing, just in case. My family and I would be out of here in no time.
It's 542 AD. On the far side of the world from Ilopango is Constantinople, capital of the 6th century Roman Empire. This is the Emperor Justinian the Great. He knows nothing of the Maya, or the volcano that's erupted. But less than a decade after 536 AD, when the Ilopango ash cloud dimmed the sun in the Mediterranean sky, his world changed forever. This time, the cause of the disaster will not be a volcanic event, but instead, an unseen terror that will ravage his empire. Within 6 years of Ilopango, on the edge of the Roman Empire in Africa, a long dormant microscopic bacterium stirs from its slumber. The demon will quickly flourish and multiply. It is the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. The plague has never been seen in Europe before, though outbreaks had occurred in Africa. This time, it sneaks into the Roman Empire via the trade route on the back of a black rat. In the spring of 542 AD, a ship approaches the city of Constantinople, bearing cargo from North Africa.
A ship loaded with grain leaves Alexandria Harbor on day 1. The rats traveling aboard are infected with the bacterium. 2 or 3 days out, one sailor starts to exhibit the very first symptoms of disease himself. The first symptoms of bubonic plague are fever, chills, sometimes delirium, as the fever gets very, very high indeed. Nobody knows why. Nobody really understands the etiology of any disease, really, at this point. Nobody knows why people get sick. Bad air, curse of God. By the time it first pulls into the harbor in the south end of the city of Constantinople, the infection is spread to every rat on board, and 2 or 3 sailors are dead.
Perhaps no man on earth has more power than Justinian the Great. But that power is useless against the catastrophe creeping up on him from where he least expects it. Within days of the cargo ship's arrival, calamity is knocking at the gates of Constantinople, capital of the Roman Empire.
It's a fairly small size, 3/4 of the island of Manhattan. When you think about 500,000 people living in that space, with no building more than 3 or 4 stories high, you
can imagine just how crowded the streets and the bazaars were at any given time of day or night.
The overcrowding sets the stage for the spread of a devastating killer.
But they didn't know where it was coming from. There was no way to quarantine people from the infection. They had no idea that the rats were causing it.
The rat carries a flea. And within the body of the flea, it carries the bacterium Yersinia pestis. As the bacterium reproduces, the flea is maddened by hunger. It will bite anything, whether it's a rat or a human, spreading the infection.
Because it's such a sly devil, it's going to be a few days after infection before you exhibit any symptoms at all. The first of them are going to be rigor, muscle tension, and high enough fever to cause delirium.
Indifferent to its victims, bubonic plague now slips within the palace walls and creeps toward Justinian the Great. No one is immune. Wealth and status afford no protection, not even for the emperor himself. It's 542 AD, and Constantinople is under siege from an enemy it can't even see. It's now day 4 of the infection.
You see swellings, starting the size of golf balls and up to the size of grapefruit. In the groin, perhaps the underarm, perhaps under the jaw. And these things cause immense pain.
The lymph glands are the breeding ground for the bacteria, causing the characteristic swelling called a bubo that gives bubonic plague its name.
One of the records that you find is just how many people commit suicide at this point.
Within the palace walls, the Emperor Justinian is now caught in the plague's clutches. This is the man who had restored the glories of the ancient Roman Empire, and who now would give his kingdom for a cure.
They had no way of treating the disease other than by making the victims as comfortable as possible. And beyond that, everything else they were likely to try was probably going to make things worse.
There are no antibiotics, no soothing drugs, no hope for a cure.
Depending on the passage of the disease at that point, you might actually develop gangrene. Shock from disruption of the body's ability to the blood to flow in limbs. And so your extremities will turn black, causing immense pain, and if it spreads shortly thereafter, sepsis, where just the body becomes a sort of tissue of bacterial culture. So blackened limbs, swellings in the groin and underarms, blood emerging from every orifice.
Then, within a week, a new and even more virulent strain of the disease emerges.
Sometimes, instead of going through the lymphatic system, the bacterium is actually able to persuade the body to carry it to the lungs. There it becomes something called pneumonic plague. And it actually becomes something that uniquely for this particular disease can be spread human to human every time you sneeze or cough. Bubonic plague, 100% fatal if untreated, and of course there was no treatment in the 6th century AD. Pretty marvelous in some evil kind of way.
As death reaps its grim harvest and pestilence reigns supreme, the realm of Emperor Justinian will undergo a change that will alter the future of the Roman Empire, beginning with a decimated population.
All the graves filled up virtually overnight. Tens of thousands of people piled into open graves. Whenever the wind blew through Constantinople, it was enough to make everyone sick all over again. And you can imagine why.
The psychological toll of living among a scourge of such magnitude can be overwhelming.
When people are confronted by undeniable signs that something is horribly wrong at a grand scale, what you'll find is that people often feel a sort of detachment from what they're seeing. People will move very slowly or shut down altogether or feel a certain numbness. There is something almost artificial about experiencing a disaster. Like, you can't quite believe this is happening. And it feels unreal.
Day 10 of the plague, when the crisis point is reached, the moment that decides who will survive and who won't.
Constantinople suffered perhaps 100,000 deaths, as many as 10,000 in a single day. It was horrific. The equivalent would be thinking about a city like New York, 10 times the size of Constantinople, with 500,000 people dying in a single summer. They thought the judgment of God was upon them.
And it's a judgment that's about to be visited on the entire known world, because everywhere that grain is shipped will now bring with it a cargo of the plague.
It was a huge historical event, a change in direction for all of European history, and maybe even more than that. The 6th century is a hinge moment in time, if ever there was one.
In Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian would survive the plague. But the arrival of Yersinia Pestis would play a major role in weakening the Roman Empire. And, along with other factors, it would contribute to its collapse. In the wake of that collapse, Europe would be plunged into the Dark Ages.
By the end of the 6th century, 25 million fewer people were living in the Mediterranean area than were living at the beginning of the 6th century, all due to the plague. It's not an accident that books and historians that write about late antiquity end their stories at the time of Justinian and begin their stories in the medieval world with his death.
The civilizations of the ancient world made sacrifice to their gods, built great empires, and sought to control nature itself. But when the Ilopango volcano erupted in Central America, and the bubonic plague preyed upon the Roman Empire, the impact represented two of the largest catastrophes in the 6th century. Two events striking two mighty empires, separated by less than a decade.